Thank you. Make sure that's not going to fall again. Yeah, I want to talk about the ways in which the IT function, which has been conceived in academic environments as a support, as a back office function, as a kind of coherent department. Oh, lovely, thank you. As a kind of back office function, as a kind of coherent department, is actually spreading to affect the entire academic enterprise. I'm not going to be that guy that doesn't have your job but tells you how to do it. So I don't want to talk about the need to provision more bandwidth, more servers, more storage. We'll have and need more of all of that next year. I want to talk about the ways in which the social turn for technologies everywhere is affecting the academic enterprise, not because social media is about the academy, but rather because social media is appearing everywhere in society, and the academy is a social institution. So let me start here, not with a story from within the academy, but something that I think illustrates one of the big changes going on. This is a bug tracking report from Bugzilla, the Mozilla Foundation's bug reporting tool. This bug showed up a few years ago. And the bug report was, when different users on one system choose to save or not save passwords, other users can see the sites that the passwords weren't saved for. So the bug report begins this way. The bug report begins this way. Ruh-roh. So this woman logs in. She's asked if she wants to save a password. She says no, and then she's presented with a list of all of the other sites on that system for which no passwords were saved, which includes JDate, Match.com, LavaLife. She shares this computer with only one other person, her fiancé. And this is how the bug report ends. So someone from Mozilla comes in and says, I don't think this is a Windows registry problem. I don't think this is a user problem. I think you all have just shared a login. And then the bug report goes on. You're better off without that guy, right? So when bug tracking software gets hijacked as a relationship advice column, right, any fantasy that IT, once it becomes fundamental to human communication, can be kept separate from the regular mess we all live in as we are communicating with one another, goes out the window. In fact, what we're seeing now is not just IT in its more function, more bandwidth, more storage, more machines. We're actually seeing it get different. We're seeing it come deeper and deeper into basic human relationships, including human relationships in the academy. And as a result, right, we're being asked not just to speed up what we're doing, but actually to adapt to a more social environment. And this is showing up everywhere, and not through planning. It's just the kinds of events that happen. So this is a picture of Chris Avenir, who a few years ago was a freshman at the University of Ryerson in Canada. And in his freshman year, Avenir took Chemistry 101, and he discovered, as generations of freshmen have done before him, that Chemistry 101 is really hard. And so he said, I can't do this by myself. I'm going to join a study group, right? The classic response to discovering that Chemistry 101 is hard. And so he goes and joins a study group. He goes and joins a study group on Facebook, because he is the generation that's grown up where not only the web was normal, but Facebook was normal. So he joins a Facebook group called The Dungeon Ryerson Chemistry 101. And, in fact, volunteers himself as an administrator on that Facebook group. And there they are, having their study group, when he gets a message from the academic dean. He's being called up on charges. 147 charges. One academic charge, one charge of academic malfeasance for having been the administrator of that Facebook group, and 146 additional charges for each other member of the group. So here's Ryerson's point of view. This is their argument. It was absolutely clear-cut. Avenir should not have been discussing this class on Facebook. To which, here's Avenir's response. which is we do this all the time. Right? So there is a huge clash of metaphor here. Right? Is Facebook more like other media? Is it like a fax machine? Is it like a mimeograph, now just in a more flexible form? Or is Facebook more like a real-world table, right, around which a study group could gather, now just rendered electronically? And the answer is that's the wrong question. Because the thing that Facebook turns out to be most like is Facebook, which is to say it does different things than either previous media or than previous social environments. In fact, if it didn't do different things, it wouldn't be useful. Right? It wouldn't have carved out the place it carved out for itself in the world. So Avenue was not trying to cheat. In fact, the reason that the study group was named the Dungeon is that that was the room on the Ryerson campus where study groups happened. Right? They just thought of themselves as adapting existing practice. Meanwhile, Ryerson thought of themselves as adapting existing practice by simply coming in with their policies around media and cheating. Right? And neither of those metaphors is good enough. Right? Neither of those metaphors lets us say, oh, there's no real challenge here. Right? We can just treat all of this social media as if it were an extension of how we've always done business. In fact, we are in a position now of having to think about what is the educational value of Facebook. Right? And we can't think about that by just adapting existing policies and applying them to this new situation. The new situation is different enough that we have to go back and ask ourselves, what's fundamental? Now, in the academic context, where we have always prized a real distinction between the serious and the frivolous, it's very difficult to make an argument that we have to integrate Facebook into our conception of our campuses. Right? When you say, I think this social media stuff is going to be important to the academic conversation, it's easy to see what the reaction is going to be. When you suggest that social media might matter for the academy, the reaction you often get is, you mean the thing with the cats? Like that's what you think is going to transform the academic environment? To which the answer is, yeah, the thing with the cats. Right? Because here's the thing about the lolcats and the Dogecoins and all the other silliness that's happening on the internet. That always happens. And I don't mean that always happens with the internet. I mean that always happens with media, full stop. The sacred printing press, the thing around which our institutions are, in many cases, quite literally organized. Right? It did not take long after the invention of the printing press for the first erotic novels to appear. It didn't take long for people to have an economic interest in selling books before somebody said to themselves, hey, you know what I bet people would pay for? Right? It took another 150 years for people to even think of the scientific journal. Right? So the idea that the printing press is inherently a serious and important tool is completely contradicted by the history of the medium. And in fact, what we can learn from the printing press is something we can apply to our current situation. We got erotic novels because we're the kind of people we are, and the printing press is the kind of tool it is. It took people trying to figure out how to take what that tool made capable and inventing new ways of using it to make people smarter that gave us the scientific journal. Right? We get lolcats because we're the kind of people we are, and the web is the kind of medium it is. As we think about trying to use this for academic purposes, we are going to have to do this again. We're going to have to figure out what parts of this medium actually fit our practice and fit our desire to make people smarter, make ourselves smarter as research, make one another smarter as publishing, make our students smarter as teaching. And this puts people responsible for IT in a position that's relatively familiar, becomes relatively familiar over the last 40 years, which is having to lead at a time when senior management often doesn't understand what's happening. Right? The normal case of large-scale changes in IT is that the executives at the top of the institution are often the last to know. Right? So the personal computer, right, was not brought into organizations by visionary CEOs. It was brought in by accountants who brought their computers from home so they could run VisiCalc or Lotus 1-2-3. Right? And the institution had to adapt. And the adaptation hit the people who dealt with the computing function before it hit senior management. Same thing happened with laptops. Right? From the C-suite's point of view, from the senior executive's point of view, spending a lot of money on very expensive, movable, stealable things didn't make much sense, but the road warriors insisted. And it was IT that had to adapt first, and the organization followed. If you'd gone and polled any chief marketing officers, any CEOs about email in the early 1990s, they would say, oh yeah, we've heard of it, we're thinking about it, we're studying it. If you went and got any sales executive's business card, it had an AOL address on it already. Right? And it was the IT department that had to adapt first. Same thing happened, of course, with instant messaging, and now the bring your own device trend. Right? Choices about what people use and how they use them come in because the users demand it, the participants demand it, the employees demand it, the students demand it. They start using it. And it is the IT department's historic function, and I believe this is happening again around social media, to help senior leadership adapt to those changes. So this is a ground plan of my home department. I teach in the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU. And this is what we looked like 10 years ago. Right? Everything in red is a workstation. It's a computer chained to a desk with a screen and a keyboard and a mouse. And you can see, we occupy only one floor of the building, and you can see 4 of our rooms are given over entirely to making space for students to sit in front of a computer that's connected to the internet. 2 years later, as we began adapting to the students increasingly bringing in laptops and the software being increasingly available, we decommissioned 2 of those rooms, and in fact, in one case, we blew out a wall, right, and opened up the specs. Right? So here we have a case where, because the students are bringing their laptops in, it's not just that we're changing the mix of machines we buy, we're changing the physical architecture of the institution. And a couple of years after that, about half a decade ago, all gone. All gone. No more workstations anywhere. We converted all of the space to other uses. This isn't because we have less technology at ITP. We are saturated in technology. It's because the technology is going partly into the walls of the institution and partly into the pockets of the faculty and the students. And figuring out how to adapt to those kinds of changes doesn't just alter the mix of what kind of IT you pay for and manage. It alters how the institution works. In our case, the biggest change, when we emptied those spaces out, right, faculty operating at our usual speed said, we should form a committee. Right? We were going to have a committee to talk about what we should do with this new space now that we'd gotten rid of the computers. And while we were doing that, the students did not wait for us. They just dragged tables and chairs around and co-opted those spaces as a collaborative environment. We see more of our students, having gotten rid of the workstations, we see more of our students. We see them collaborating more, sometimes officially on class projects, but sometimes just, hey, I don't understand this. Can you give me a hand with this? Do you have some advice? Right? They knew what to do with the space we opened up for them. While we were busily saying, oh, let's have a plan, they showed us what the value was. Over and over again, we see these kinds of changes where a space opens up, sometimes literally, always figuratively, where people can try new things. And learning from those experiments becomes the function of institutional adaptation. Right? Making the space for the experiments can be a departmental function. But learning from the experiments, figuring out what the value is of these kinds of changes, right? That's a job for everybody, and it changes the institutions that adopt it. So as we saw with the entry of the PC into the workplace, as we saw with the entry of the email into the workplace, the laptop, instant messaging, now tablets and phones, there is not a set of decisions from senior executives that just trickles down, right? There is a constant back and forth between the institutions and the people who occupy it. And in times of dramatic change, it is the people and not the institutions that typically take the leading role. Right? We're in a world now where all of us have all of these new capabilities. In some cases, physical capabilities in our pocket. In some cases, collaborative capabilities in the cloud. And we're all changing our practices. And historically, people who have sat in your seat are in a position both of enabling those experiments, but also trying to figure out what's happening with them, learning from them, and helping the institution as a whole adapt. I want to talk a little bit about what people's expectations increasingly are inside of academic environments, because it is those expectations that are going to lead to the kinds of changes we're going to see from the uses of these new technologies. So let me start here. Again, not an academic tool, but as I'll talk more about in a moment, that distinction matters less than we're used to it matter. So this is Foursquare. It is a check-in service when you go out to a bar or a coffee shop or a restaurant or what have you. You say, here I am. Foursquare knows who you are. It knows who your friends are. And so it generates this kind of social map. You can see where you go. You can see where your friends go. You can become the mayor of a certain place if you hang out there long enough and so forth. And Foursquare generates this incredible stream of data from the people who use it, who are documenting their lives out on the town. And then it generates at will what looks like a kind of daily, quarterly report, as it were, where it will tell you these are the nights you went out, these are the nights you stayed home, and so forth. Now, I show you this not just to say, oh, to be young again, but also to point out that young people now have better, more accurate, more detailed information about their drinking habits than about their study habits. Right? That can't last. That gap can't last. This is the expectation of someone who has a phone in their pocket, which is that if there is a behavior that matters to them, they can detail it and see it and react to it. And that expectation from the outside world, from the world of social apps with no thought of larger civic value, is nevertheless changing people's behavior as they consider what's possible. So, one of the things I think we need to get over in the academy is the idea that our ones and zeros are special. Right? There has been a history of assuming that technologies that are fitted for the academy have to be designed for the academy and marketed to the academy and sold to the academy. But if we're really at a point of thinking from first principles, what is it we do? What's our job in society? We have only one job. Our job is to make people smarter. Sometimes we make ourselves smarter. That's research. Sometimes we make each other smarter. That's publishing. Sometimes we make our students smarter. That's teaching. Those are the three components of making other people smarter. But it doesn't have to happen in specially designed environments. In fact, the desire to be smarter is a basic human urge. So here's a site called Rap Genius. And Rap Genius does much what you'd expect. It puts up the lyrics to popular rap songs. And then people can go in and they click on it and they can annotate the lyrics in order to explain, say, what 50 Cent is talking about. And early on in the history of Rap Genius, people started uploading other kinds of documents. So here's the Mayflower Compact, which was when the colonies finally, when the British colonies were finally established, mostly by sending your religious zealots over to us. Thanks for that. People start annotating these documents because Rap Genius, although it is set up for annotating rap lyrics, is in fact just a way of saying, as a group, can we understand a piece of text? Right? So if Rap Genius can be used as part of an educational conversation, then there isn't any absolute distinction between what we do in the academy and what people do in the outside world. I'm not saying that custom-designed academic tools are useless. I'm saying that to be useful, they have to do better than what people experience in the outside world. And that means understanding what people are experiencing in the outside world. The ability to get information about your own behavior, like dodgeball, the ability to take a piece of text and with a group of people, comb through it and create these kinds of annotations. That is the IT infrastructure that people are taking for granted outside of our institutions. And it's going to start to shape what we think about inside our institutions. So to think about things from first principles, we have to go and ask ourselves, what's real? What are we trying to optimize for? So this is a list of the big chunks of metadata that we often traffic with. Class, course, credit, grade, department, subject, and degree. Right. There are lots and lots of other little bits of metadata. There's the semester and the grade point average and so forth. But these are the big 7. And the really important thing to remember about these is that not one of them is real. Not one of them refers to any underlying piece of reality that you could point to if you didn't know what institution you were inside. They are all stock-keeping units. And stock-keeping units are really important, right? You've got to keep track of things if you're in an organization. But these are just ways of making our jobs more convenient. If you want to talk about what's real, it's a much shorter list. Right? This is what we build our institutions around. And we build an enormous amount of complexity around these things. But there are people who are leading a conversation. There are people who are participating in a conversation. And there are all of the artifacts other than face-to-face. There are books and journals. There are computer terminals and cloud services. But it really comes down to this. What is the encounter between teacher and learner, even in cases of research, and what artifacts are they using to undertake those tasks? And when you see that, when you realize that that's the conversation that matters to people, you start to see all of these crazy hybrids that don't look like what we're used to. So when Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig launched their famous MOOC in 2011, fall of 2011, Introduction to Artificial Intelligence, the students said exactly what Chris Avenir had said. They said, this is really hard. I can't do this by myself. Right? And so although the Thrun and Norvig class was conducted as if it was a lecture, right? Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig, Peter Norvig and Sebastian Thrun are going to download the contents from their brains into yours. The students immediately went and created a social context. Right? They created a subreddit for the discussion of that class. They went on to Reddit and created their own environment for discussing that class. They created meetups. There was a meetup around this class in New York City that had 168 members. More people in one city getting together to talk about that class than were enrolled in any physical artificial intelligence class anywhere in the world in that semester. This is a source of hybridization, right? This is a source of academic value that the students drag into the conversation. Not the teachers, not the provost, not the deans. And yet it becomes part of their education. Adapting to that becomes our challenge. Right? Even libraries, right? The history of libraries is the history of the institution in many ways, right? This is a picture of a library from Cambridge. Created just before 1600, 1590, up at Trinity College. There were so few books and they were so precious that they were bolted to the desks. You went to the physical space to do the reading. If that sounds like mainframes and batch processing, right, you understand the logic of the library in those days. Right? By the 1800s, the libraries have gotten considerably larger. Books have gotten cheaper. There are enough different copies of a book that you can imagine a circulating library for the first time. And then, by the 2000s, this is a library that was opened just in 2009 in Germany. Huge, enormously large. And yet, even libraries, those sites of solo encounters with other writers, are starting to get social value. Right? As IT permeates every aspect of the academic conversation. People are inventing library-friendly licenses for works, which specifically recognize the library's ability to own a copy of a digital work. Right? Because in the days of physical ownership, you didn't know and you didn't have to care whether a library was buying it or not. But as digital rights start to encumber our ability to share materials, people are thinking through this again. People are starting to look at books as social networks. Which books are referring to other books, and also which people are checking out books in which combinations. So even here, right, even in the collection of literature, there is a social turn to creating this kind of value. And you start to see, and this is Digital Public Library of America, a large-scale experiment in digital library collaboration. The community shelves. People who liked X also liked Y. It's the logic of Amazon, but now rendered in a scholarly way rather than a commercial way. These are experiments that are sponsored by academic institutions, but they are being brought in by the users, and their value is social. And this, I think, is the big shift we all face. IT, as you heard in the introduction, IT used to be thought of as a relatively discrete department, a relatively back office function, an important thing to provision in the same way you have to have hot water in the dorms. It is not like that anymore. IT now provides the substrate for most of the academic conversation, full stop. The number of papers written that are written in collaborations between institutions, in some cases in different continents, could not happen without these kinds of tools. And the academics are responding. Younger academics are starting to do things like field work. Here is Ansha Meena, who's doing field work. And her field work, her ethnographic field work, is done using Tumblr, Foursquare, Flickr, Gmail, Twitter, Facebook, Evernote, Dropbox, and Instagram. Right? Not one of those tools designed for academic use, all of those tools being pulled in for academic work. Keith Devlin, a mathematician out at Stanford, who went and self-published a mathematics textbook, said of the experience, right, I can now be my own publisher. The whole system is so well worked out that even the function of publishing, which had been an entire separate department, can now be taken on by professors. And this shows up over and over and over again. It is, I think, the key thing to understand about what's going on, especially with the faculty. We're used to the idea that students are walking onto campus with phones and tablets and have expectations of the IT infrastructure that are different than a previous generation. But I want to emphasize that what's happening is also happening to the academic conversation, even in the most abstract realms of human thought. So this is Tim Gowers, a Fields Medal winning mathematician, who a few years ago kicked off a quiet revolution in mathematics with a blog post called "Is Massively Collaborative Mathematics Possible?" Now, mathematics is the field that is the most associated with the lone genius, right, working on a problem by him or herself. And what Gowers said was, if all of these tools are enabling collaboration in other domains, can we try that in mathematics? This is, to my mind, the most radical outside edge of experimentation in the academy, not just because it's massively collaborative in the manner of Wikipedia, but because it's massively collaborative around mathematics. And Gowers said in this post, right, if we do this, we have to rethink how we're doing mathematics. Here's what you wouldn't do. You wouldn't go away for weeks or months at a time and work out what you thought was the right answer, which of course is how mathematics has been practiced since time immemorial. You would instead just jump into the fray. And so in response to this suggestion of Gowers, the Polymath Wiki and Polymath blog were created. And this is the site of massively collaborative mathematics. And they named their problems. Here's a problem called Polymath 4. And they do exactly what Gowers said. They are using IT to go in and kick in any relevant information and to try to wrestle that into some publishable form. And it works. Polymath 4 is a paper on finding prime numbers. I'm not competent to review the mathematics, but I understand what the subject is about. They submitted it to the Journal of the Mathematics of Computation. And here's the response they got back. we want to publish this paper. This is good. This deals with something fundamental. Here are some notes. Now, I like proofreading as much as the next guy, but it's worth noting that what the journal contributed was nothing mathematical, that all of the work had already been worked out by the relevant participants. And in fact, anyone anywhere in the world who cared about that particular version of prime number finding could find their way to that blog and that wiki. Nothing was hidden. So then they go back on the Polymath blog and they have to discuss the possibility of this publication. You know, we've got to whip this up into paper form. And then there's this. Right? When the Journal of the Mathematics of Computation sent the paper back, they sent it back saying, you forgot to tell us who wrote this. On the assumption that it was going to be obvious who wrote it, right? And they had just forgotten to write it down. They couldn't understand that, in fact, the way the academics were now working was so radically different from the assumptions made in the entire history of journal publishing, from Philosophical Transactions to now, that there's no concept of authorship that fits neatly between what they did and what the journal expects. So they just put up a list. They say, if you think you wrote this paper, tell us, and we'll put your name down. Right? And there's some self-policing there. I couldn't go in and say, oh, I wrote this paper. Right? They know who was there. They know who the participants were. But now they regard authorship as a kind of after-the-fact thing that they have to generate in order that the journal will accept their paper. Right? For all of the value the Journal of Mathematics of Computation added to this paper, they might as well change their title to the Journal of Ike and Has Tenure. Right? Because this was effectively a post hoc stamp of approval. All of the relevant material had been public. All of the people who wanted to participate were free to, whether they did or not. Right? And journals, which in the beginning of their lives were tools for increasing the speed and the radius of the dissemination of information, have now become tools for decreasing the speed and the radius of information. Because of the academic paywalls, because of the high cost of journals, because you have to have an academic affiliation to see them, the original goal of the journal has now moved to the web. Right? So, started with Chris Avenir, right? A student dragging Facebook into studying for Chemistry 101, and with Tim Gowers, right? Someone operating at the absolute forefront of mathematical knowledge. In all of those cases, there are two things that are similar from the freshman to the most serious scholar. One, there is a social turn in what people expect the technology to support. Right? It isn't any longer the computer as a box. It is the computer as a door. It is a way for us to use these tools to find each other, to collaborate, and to create shared value at all layers of the academic conversation. And two, the degree of hybridization we've seen in the academic environment already is nothing compared to what's coming. Almost none of what I have shown uses any tool specifically designed to support academics. Facebook study groups, wikis, weblogs, Instagram for ethnographers, down the list. These are tools that are being dragged in sideways into the institution in the same way the personal computer was, in the same way that the tablets were. Right? But now, instead of bring your own device, it's bring your own collaborative environment. And it will fall to the IT department, as it always does, to bridge and integrate that change. Right? The people who are at the tops of our institutions are very often the people who came up through a system that was very different from these kinds of tools and these kinds of expectations. And yet they will have to adapt to the existence of these tools and expectations because the people are dragging them in sideways. So let me end with one last point, now taken from the larger society, not from the academic conversation in particular. This is a picture of people watching the Super Bowl. Super Bowl is one of our sporting events in the United States. It's basically like rugby with more violence and more committee meetings. This, however, is a picture of people watching the Super Bowl from television. This is a still from a sitcom. This is what people who work in TV think that watching TV is like. Everyone is glued to the screen. Right? This is a picture of actual people watching the actual Super Bowl. And you will notice the difference. Right? I would love, as a faculty member, to believe that this is what it's like to be in my classroom. Right? That everyone is looking at me. I have the students' full attention. The beams of enlightenment are moving from my brow to theirs, but that's not true. Right? I know it's not true, especially me, given what I study. We have to adapt to a world in which what the students are capable of is like this. Right? We can't lament the days in which their ability to connect laterally with one another is a distraction and wish it would go away. We have to internalize it. We have to adapt to a world in which this is what it looks like for our student population and increasingly for the whole academic conversation. Right? And that adaptation, as it always has been, is not just a matter of institutional decision-making, but of figuring out where on the conversation of institutional norms versus individual behaviors we can create new hybrids. Thank you very much.